Rampage is hardly a game that anyone was ever clamoring for more of. It's a very repetitive experience, and it was very novel at the time, but nobody was on the edge of their seat waiting for a sequel. Which means it's very baffling that it got 4 sequels. In this video, we're going to take a look through all 5 games in chronological order and talk about their game design, what worked, what didn't, and what changed over the years. Because Rampage has a legacy, a broken, forgotten, often disliked legacy, but a legacy nonetheless, and one that deserves being talked about. In spite of not really having a genre, the concept of the original Rampage is fairly easy to grasp. You're a giant monster, you climb up the sides of buildings and destroy them to advance to the next area. It's a novel concept that wasn't really done by anyone else in the time period and was only done later by officially licensed Godzilla games, as far as I can tell. The sad thing is that outside of being unique, there isn't much that Rampage really offers. Sure, there was nothing else like it at the time period, and there still aren't too many things like it now, but that doesn't make it good or interesting. There's a distinct lack of nuance to the design, and it feels like everything besides the building punching was just placed there to distract me from how boring and soulless everything is. And although what little design the game has is minimal and ultimately amounts to nothing for other reasons, we're still going to talk about it for a bit. Firstly, it's possible to eat people to restore a completely inconsequential amount of health, so little health that you might not even notice it's being restored if you aren't paying really close attention or reading the blurbs between levels. There are also a few varieties of enemies. There are helicopters that dive bomb you while spraying machine gun fire, there are enemies running across the ground that will trick you into eating dynamite when you grab them, and there are bombers that are specifically designed to knock you off the sides of buildings. And I'm sure none of that sounds particularly bad, but you have to remember this is an arcade game. And all of that stuff I just mentioned, being able to refill your health by eating people, the different enemy patterns, none of that matters because this game is quarter-munching bullshit. Arcade games are, after all, firstly made to take your quarters, and there are some arcade games that manage to balance quarter-munching with reasonable challenge where your skill actually matters. Rampage is not one of those. There's no such thing as a no-death Rampage run. Dying is inevitable, you're gonna die a lot, and there's not even an ending. The game goes 768 levels before looping. Ultimately, the game's biggest claim to fame and the only reason to recommend it is to mindlessly destroy buildings, but that's today, where you can play the game for free in a variety of fashions. Back when this game came out, it would eat your wallet. And it would eat it because it's cynical cash grab bullshit that used its unique premise to draw in people that didn't know any better. This isn't Galaga or Pac-Man, this is a game that can't even be played well. Shame on you, Midway. After a decade of silence, we got a surprise sequel in Rampage World Tour, which isn't a complete pile of shit. It's still recognizable as Rampage at its core, but it has a bunch of improvements and new mechanics that make it more than just a cynical cash grab this time around. Let's start with the improvements first. In the original Rampage, there were sometimes power-ups and food hidden inside the walls of buildings you destroyed. They appeared so infrequently that you could be forgiven for forgetting they were there. However, in World Tour, they're a much bigger part of the design and aesthetic. Not only do they appear far more frequently, but there's much greater variety in them as well. They've become such a core part of the Rampage design at this point in the series that it's difficult to imagine what World Tour would be like without them. It would certainly feel a lot different, that's for sure. Another improvement is that eating things to heal yourself is now a more valid game mechanic. In the original, eating things to heal yourself was inconsequential, and in World Tour it's almost inconsequential, but not quite. Eating people or eating food inside buildings in World Tour will actually extend your life noticeably. A small amount, but noticeably. Now that we're done talking about the improvements upon the original Rampage, let's talk about what's new. The biggest addition to the game, and the one I use the most frequently, is that now you can attack buildings from above. In the original Rampage, you could only attack buildings from the side. Being able to punch or stomp from the roof allows you to destroy single levels of buildings much easier, which means that destroying buildings as a whole is much quicker, while still allowing you to see the items inside. It's such an efficient method of destroying buildings, in fact, that actually attacking buildings from the side seems like a waste of time now. The player moveset has also gotten its share of additions. For example, now when jumping you can flap through the air to hover by rapidly tapping the button, allowing for a much more graceful descent. There are also rideable vehicles that you can use to destroy buildings quicker, though they quickly self-destruct. And I suppose I should also mention that they added a kicking mechanic that you can use to hit enemies on the ground or attack the sides of buildings, but it seems just to be a replacement for the punch, so I use the punch instead. So we've established World Tour has expanded on the basic game design from Rampage and added several new mechanics that make the game design an actual thing and make the game appear less like a soulless cash grab. And the new art style and punk sense of humor only help to make the game feel a lot more fresh. However, all is not well in Rampage World Tour. It's still not a good game in spite of all the improvements for a few reasons, the biggest one being that the game is still arcade bullshit. Death is still inevitable, skill still matters almost no amount, and the fact that you die less frequently doesn't mean the game is more fair, it just means it's less noticeable how unfair it is. No matter how good you are at the game, there is no such thing as a no-death run of Rampage World Tour. Just as in the original, it isn't built to meet you halfway, it's built to take your quarters. But World Tour at least has enough going for it that I can acknowledge its secondary problem. A problem that the original Rampage also had, but I didn't acknowledge it because I refuse to believe that anyone played the original Rampage long enough to notice. Rampage World Tour is unreasonably repetitive. All of the levels feel nearly identical. It doesn't matter what city you're in or how far you are in the game, all of the buildings are destroyed the exact same way. There are 120 stages of this. So what do we have when you mash it all together? Well, we have a pretty bad game. We have a pretty bad game with a cute art style, with a cute sense of humor, massive improvements over its predecessor that's ungodly repetitive and still wants to eat your quarters. But hey, it's better. And while Rampage World Tour was not successful in arcades, it was very successful in another market. Yep, what you're seeing right here, the console version of Rampage World Tour, this is the reason Rampage is a series instead of just two arcade games that people completely forgot about. And after spending some time with the console version of Rampage World Tour, hey, guess what? It's Rampage World Tour. Pretty much the exact same game, only now it's on your console. It also managed to completely avoid a pitfall that a lot of arcade games fall into when they're ported to console. A lot of arcade games, when they're ported to console, still try to maintain some semblance of challenge. This means adding a limited live system, since putting quarters into your home console is not an option. And depending on exactly how well the developers know their game, a limited live system doesn't have to be a bad thing. They could easily give you just the right amount of lives to finish the game. But Rampage World Tour is a long-ass game. So they just decided not to bother and gave the player unlimited continues instead. This was a very smart move, not only because it eliminated the risk of the game getting frustrating, but because it turned the game into what everyone already thought it was. An incredibly mindless, repetitive button masher. And it turns out the home console market had a demand for incredibly mindless, unchallenging multiplayer button mashers. So you can thank tasteless little children in their Nintendo 64s and PS1s across the world for the next two sequels. When Midway saw how successful World Tour was on the console market and realized how simple it would be to make sequels to a game as simple as World Tour, they got the fuck on that right away. And in 1999, only 1 year after World Tour's console release, we got Rampage Universal Tour. Universal Tour's reputation in comparison with World Tour is somewhat depressing. World Tour wasn't exactly a world-class game, pun intended, and it was far from a critical darling. So when Universal Tour came out and was pretty much just an expansion pack to World Tour, it was less than well received. And I'm gonna go ahead and say that's for good reason. So little had changed between World Tour and Universal Tour. All of the game mechanics are nearly identical, and there are a few additions, but some of them make the game worse, and some of them are inconsequential. We're still going to talk about the changes Universal Tour made, of course, because I find them pretty interesting. The biggest changes made were those made to ensure that the game felt more like a console game than World Tour. If you recall, I mentioned that when arcade games are ported to consoles, they tend to have a new limited life system to maintain some semblance of challenge. Well, Universal Tour is a console exclusive game, so it also has a limited life system. It was a bad idea. The plus side to having a limited life system is now the player has to play smart. They have to actively look for health pickups inside buildings and not just run headfirst into trouble as they would in the arcade original or its console counterpart. The negative to the limited life system is that running mindlessly into combat like the arcade original and its console counterpart is why World Tour was successful in the first place. I will hand it to Avalanche Studios for trying to make the limited life system work. There are bonus games where you can gain extra lives, and health pickups now heal you far more than they did in World Tour, but ultimately it's still a frustrating experience and completely misunderstands why World Tour was successful. World Tour was not a game that was made to meet the player halfway. It was a game made to eat your quarters, and when it stopped eating your quarters it became mindless. Universal Tour, on the other hand, is World Tour, but it does try to meet you halfway, and it sucks at it. So it doesn't even have being mindless to fall back on. To top it all off, the couple of genuinely good ideas it had would actually be expanded on by further games in the series in a much better way. Universal Tour is a bad game, and there's no reason to recommend it, even if you really liked Rampage World Tour. It's pretty not good. Rampage Through Time is another sequel to World Tour, and it does some things right and a lot of things very not right. First of all, you have unlimited continues again, meaning the game is now thoroughly unchallenging and mindless in the same way as World Tour was on console. On the bright side, this means that Midway and Avalanche Studios understood why World Tour was successful. On the dark side, it's still World Tour, again. It carries over a couple of improvements from Universal Tour, such as the ability to select your monster, monsters having different stats from each other, and your super meter, which fills up when you destroy buildings, and you can use to activate an incredibly underwhelming special attack. So Rampage Through Time has Universal Tour's new mechanics without the limited life system, but surely it's not just a combination of Universal Tour and World Tour, right? There must be more to it. Well, barely. Rampage Through Time has two brand new, ill-advised additions all to itself. The first addition being that the single-player campaign mode now has two computer-controlled characters playing with you at all times, a feature that cannot be turned off, and the computer characters don't cooperate well. In fact, they seem to favor punching you in the back of the head wherever possible. They also don't climb buildings with you, making it way more difficult to attack buildings from above, which is one of the greatest improvements from World Tour. The second new addition is that there are a whole ton of party minigames. Because the game thinks it's Mario Party all of a sudden, you can even play the minigames separately. It's ultimately just a more frustrating version of World Tour due to the two computer characters, and the special meter and the new selectable monsters don't make up for that. What the hell were you guys doing? Oh my god, someone made a decent Rampage game. Stop the presses, I think the world's fucking ending. Yes indeed, Rampage Total Destruction, headed by Pipeworks, veterans of the giant monsters genre, finally turns Rampage into something respectable. It improves on nearly every aspect of the original Rampage series. The power-ups hidden inside buildings are now even more pronounced, even more varied, and have even more humorous and helpful effects than before, making them an even greater part of the gameplay than they were in World Tour. Attacking buildings from the roof is now easier than ever thanks to a new pound attack. You regain more health than ever from eating people and from eating food inside buildings. The latter sometimes refills a quarter of your health bar. There are also new mobility options such as a double jump and mid-air spin, as well as unlockable moves like a charge punch and mid-air stomp. The special meter and selectable monsters are returning from Universal Tour and Rampage Through Time, but now they have more meaning than ever. The difference in stats between the selectable monsters is a lot more noticeable and a lot more pronounced, and the special meter now has multiple functions. It enables you to use certain unlockable attacks like the Roar, but if you fill it up all the way, it activates Rampage mode, which makes all your attacks much faster and more powerful. Infinitely more useful than the special attacks in previous Rampage games. But this isn't just about new shit your monster can do. Rampage Total Destruction adds depth to the core point of the entire Rampage series: destroying buildings. Total Destruction introduces a new combo system where if you weaken a building sufficiently by pounding it with a bunch of weak blows and then deliver a couple of heavy ones, several levels of the building will collapse simultaneously, giving you a huge combo and point multiplier. This means that it actually matters where and how you attack buildings in Total Destruction, something that mattered incredibly little, sometimes not at all, in the previous Rampage games. It feels incredible to say, but there's actual strategy here. And perhaps the most genius thing about this combo system is that it is entirely optional. It's always there in the background, adding a whole lot of depth to the game for anyone who wants to explore it and get a high score on the level, but for those who just want to destroy buildings mindlessly, knock yourself out, that's still an option. The game in no way punishes you for avoiding the combo system, which is something I think is ultimately a good decision considering the audience they were catering to. So if you don't care about the really cool new combo and building destruction mechanics, what's left for you in Rampage Total Destruction? Well, probably what you thought you were going to get when you bought another Rampage game, really. You mindlessly level a bunch of buildings and then move on to the next stage where you do the same thing. Sure, there's a whole ton of new ways to do it, but it's still Rampage. The game balance also noticeably suffers from an issue that World Tour also suffered from. It's far easier to destroy buildings from above than from the side or from the front. Of course, if you want to mess with the new combo system, destroying them from the side and front is a must. But if all you care about is advancing in the game, then simply stomping on top of the buildings is the way to go. And from reading the critical reception regarding Total Destruction, I get the impression this is what most people did. Just mash on the buildings from above until they go down. Total Destruction is a game where you get what you want to get from it, and if all you want to get from it is mindlessly destroying buildings, then that's all you're going to get. It's still a lot better at mindless destruction, and a lot better at being strategic than any of the previous Rampage games. It is difficult to be better at both of those things simultaneously, but hey, they managed it. Outside of improving on the Rampage series in every way, adding more depth, and in general making the series not a joke anymore, there are a few things that are almost entirely forgettable about the game. There are the challenges that you get in each block, where you're tasked with destroying a boss, collecting a certain number of points, destroying street lamps, what have you. Sometimes completing these challenges gives you a new move, and sometimes they only offer points. None of them are all that fun to complete, and most of the time they feel like a huge chore. But just as with the new combo and building destruction mechanics, they're very easily ignored in favor of plain old mindlessness if you prefer. Rampage Total Destruction is the best way I can imagine to marry traditional Rampage sensibilities with something resembling thoughtful design. And as such, it's the best Rampage game I think we could hope for. Yeah, it's still way too repetitive, but it learned from the mistakes of its predecessors and compared to them, it's a goddamn masterpiece.